Guys, hope everybody had a good weekend and is ready to get back after it for our Unit 3. So we've covered writing skills, historical thinking skills, founding documents in the last unit, and now we're actually going to get started on stuff that you guys haven't really talked about in history before, and specifically this unit, it'll be industrialization and progressivism. So these are some of the standards that we're going to be talking about. So the rise of the industrial society, how this really impacted our workforce, and then big business moving forward, along with immigration and migration. So these are some of the things we'll talk about in the upcoming standards and upcoming days. Also, Western migration and then the struggles of it. So how we migrated out west, but how that really impacted Indians and the settlements out west. Also, talk about how racial discrimination was still evident across the South, even after the Civil War and even after Reconstruction. All right. One of the last things we'll talk about is the progressive movement. And this was something where people within this movement wanted to make life better for you within America. And we'll kind of talk about how they wanted to attack the government and what they really wanted to change. All right. Some of the essential questions in this unit. So these are the things that I really want to guide our unit towards our assessment at the end of the unit. So I really want to talk about big business and then how did the U.S. government try to control it. So before industrialization, the U.S. government really never had to deal with something this big. So it was definitely a new change for them. How did they control it and how did big business react? Also, because of big business, organized labor came about. And what was the impact of this? When you combine your voice with others, how does that really impact society and then those businesses as well? We're going to talk about immigration and internal migration. What were the differences between those? And then how did it impact the workforce along with the economy? Because if you're moving from the South to the North, or if you're an immigrant coming from Europe to the North, it's probably different and you're treated differently. So we're going to talk about that probably next week. And then still talk about how racism was present in the South and how it was evident across the South. And then again, the progressive movement, what were Americans trying to fix? All right. So again, we're going to be talking about the rise of the industrial society today specifically. What this standard it really means. It talks about the rise of corporations and then how that heavy industry transformed the American economy. Americans had never seen this type of industry before. Before the Industrial Revolution, it was more about farming, small mechanized farming, and there wasn't really anything this big. So it was definitely an adjustment for Americans, and we're going to be talking about that. So what I want you to be able to do, I want you to be able to compare and contrast the positive and then the negative effects of the Industrial Revolution and then how they are evident within society. Okay. So first things first, we really need to talk about what was the Industrial Revolution. So the biggest thing I want you to take away from this, it was the shift from handmade to machine-made products. So that's kind of what I was talking about. Before the Industrial Revolution, America's economy was really small scale farming, small goods produced. After the Industrial Revolution, it really refers to that handmade to machine-made products. And this is a perfect example right here on this picture. You can see that smoke is boiling out of these factories, and there are a lot of different factories. So this really transformed the American landscape right here. All right. So it kind of talks about the second industrial revolution in this slide. The first industrial revolution took place in the 1800s before the Civil War. So America was on this upswing, kind of trying to produce more goods and trade those across the world. However, this was stopped by the Civil War in the 1860s, and then it was revamped after the Civil War. Late 1880s, really upswinged in the 1890s. All right. And that's kind of what it talks about here. That second industrial revolution really upswinged in the late 1800s. All right. This industrial revolution really changed the means of production, and it really changed the means through improvements in technology. So, for example, there were electric motors created within factories, which really improved production of certain goods. Also, the assembly line. So you didn't really have to make the product by yourself anymore. You had a specific job within the factory on the assembly line, and it really produced more efficiency within the factory. And we'll kind of get into more of this within the later slides. All right. So what the Industrial Revolution really referred to as in America is the Gilded Age. So this is really in the 1890s, and it's about the second Industrial Revolution. However, what people really want to talk about with this it's marked by enormous growth and then consolidation of this growth, wealth, and ownership. So some of these major industries included railroads, automobiles, steel, oil, and electric. So these are all those different companies or corporations. However, these companies and corporations were forming monopolies. All right. So only one person was in control of the railroads. Only one person was really in control of the oil. Only one person was controlled of the steel. All right. And this really benefited those people at the very top. However, they kind of outgrew and outbid those other businesses that tried to compete with them. And at the end of the day, it hurt those small scale workers and small scale companies. Okay. This also created the concept of capitalism, which we still use to this day, where businesses are allowed to compete in the open market. However, it was really hard during this time period because monopolies were formed. However, the Gilded Age also promoted monopolies to be banned. All right, and we're going to get through all this during this unit. I kind of just wanted to give an overview of what to expect here. All right, so some of the negative effects of the Industrial Revolution. I kind of already talked about a little bit of this. However, it marked a shift in agricultural workers to factory workers. And then this is where you're going to really see that internal migration play a huge role. So a lot of the farms in the South, people were tired of farm life. It was rough. It was tough. You didn't really make much money out of it. So they kind of wanted to experience something new. So this moved a lot of people from the rural South to the urban North. So you would see people from Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia move to those higher populated areas in the North, including New York, Philadelphia, Boston, to try to find a better life within the factory. However, when they got there, they didn't realize how bad the working and living conditions really would be. Okay, and now I'll show you a couple pictures on the next slide. However, so rural living to urban living really transformed this American landscape. And it really meant moving from rural farms in the South, to those big cities in the North. And then this graph shows a really good job of kind of depicting how this looked within society. So in 1870, over 50% of the workforce in America dealt in agriculture. However, by 1890, which is the start of the Gilded Age, you see only like 42% engaged in the agricultural business. However, you see this is just a trend that is going down. By 1910, 30%. So in a little under 40 years, you see that huge drop, and it just keeps dropping. All right. And, this is a cause of many things. Mechanized farming, which I'll get to in a couple slides, really improved agricultural output. So not many more people had to produce crops because one farmer could produce more crops now. However, these factories in these big cities really needed more workers, and these more workers came from the internal migration. All right. So like I said, working and living conditions really decreased in these urban settings. And here's an example of this. So these are some of those living conditions. So you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, probably another one tucked away back here. 6 people cramped in a small room. Okay, and this is where they would live. So you see these are the beds. There was bowls up here, and there's not a lot of ventilation. There's no windows. So these are where those people lived in these urban settings. It was hot. It was humid. It was dry. Like I said, no ventilation. So it was just awful living conditions. Okay. And these were just apartments and tenants built upon each other. All right. And then here you can see this kid is probably no older than 8, 9 years old. You see that he's also working in the factory, no shoes on, no protection. Okay. Before the progressive movement, there were no child labor laws, meaning kids as young as 9, 10, 11 could work in these factories and make a living for these families. All right. So when these families would move from the rural South to the urban North, they realized that almost everybody had to pitch in to make ends meet. This is because those factories did not pay well at all. So that's kind of why we saw an increase in child labor that really promoted kids to get involved within the businesses. All right. So these are some examples of poor working and living conditions. And kind of talking about here, Upton Sinclair in the Jungle. This is actually an activity you guys are going to be doing after this. However, I kind of wanted to briefly talk about this. The jungle and St. Clair really go into depth about the poor working conditions within specific businesses. So this really targets the meatpacking industry. And in this book, St. Clair kind of goes within this industry and specific factories and really talks about how awful it is to work in these different businesses on different factories. So he describes the awful working conditions within the industry, and this really included using diseased, rotten, and contaminated meats. So this is the product that you would get as a consumer, and obviously it was awful. So this really pushed regulations and laws put forth by the FDA on specific institutions. All right. So now today in a meatpacking industry, it's regulated by the government. It's regulated by the FDA. So these things don't happen and people don't get sick. All right. And how this happened, it was called a muckraker. So these were reform-minded journalists within the progressive era in the United States. So again, this time period, 1890s to 1920s, the American landscape was just transforming every day. And then this was something to really put the benefit to the people. All right. Big businesses were booming during this time. However, the common people were suffering. So these journalists really wanted to put an eye on these big businesses to see what they were doing wrong, and they wanted the common people to benefit. Okay. So, however, not everything was bad within the Industrial Revolution. There were also some positive effects of the Industrial Revolution. So again, people moving from the south to the north wasn't just because they wanted to get out of farming. Farming became easier, so not so many people had to do it anymore. And this included mechanized farming. So what mechanized farming really meant is that farming didn't really become hand-picked anymore. There were a lot of machines and production tools to be able to use. This included the McCormick reaper, the thresher, and then the steel plow. So this reaper allowed farms to grow food for many people with fewer amount of farmers. All right. So back at the start of the United States, there were a lot of just farmers that grew for themselves and families around them. However, now 100 years later, 120 years later, we have fewer farmers able to produce for a larger population. And again, this is evident today. Not everybody is a farmer in the United States. You see that people are able to produce food for a surplus amount of people. All right. And then this was due to improvement in the machines. This improvement in machines replaced that human labor. Okay. And again, these are some examples of that down here. And then this was an example of the McCormick reaper. So this was able to harvest crops at a faster rate rather than human labor would be able to. Okay. And then again, some of the other positive effects here. I kind of already talked about the assembly line. However, this was used in factories, which allowed production for mass goods. So, for example, on that assembly line, you only had one job. So if you're producing automobiles like you were on here, maybe you only put the tires onto the automobile. Okay. That was different from when we were only producing things in one essence. Before the assembly line, people were asking to just produce one car, for an example. All right, that might take 10 days to be able to do that. However, when the assembly line was created, this really improved that mass production. All right. Electric motors allowed for larger industrial plants. So that electric motor really kept the wheels turning on the production. All right. Some of those innovations within this time period included the light bulb, skyscraper. So that's where you really see American cities to build up during this time. The airplane, automobile are some examples. So that improved methods of transportation. So now you can get places quicker than you could before. All right. So those are some of the positive effects of the Industrial Revolution. And then again, there were also negative effects on the Industrial Revolution here. Again, so I want you guys to be able to compare those positive and the negative effects within the Industrial Revolution. All right, so this is all that I need from you guys today. Make sure you guys took notes over this. The PowerPoint is within Schoology in that Week 1 Unit 3 folder. After you guys are done watching this, go ahead and knock out that St. Clair activity where you're going to read excerpts from the jungle and answer the questions associated with those. Okay, hey, email me with any questions you guys may have. Thank you.